The faint tick of the kitchen clock echoed as she laughed, my own daughter-in-law, when I asked for a ride to my checkup. Still, I just wiped my hands on the dish towel, like the punchline hadn't landed where it was meant to. As the clock kept ticking, it sounded less like time passing and more like a countdown. While she scrolled past me without care, I marked the moment she stopped seeing me as worth the drive. The same ticking followed her into the lawyer's office 3 weeks later, alone, confident, unprepared. That's when she learned, I don't beg for rides, I rewrite destinations. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe. Dinner ended the way it usually did. Too much silence, not enough warmth. The faint clink of dishes was the only sound in the house as Grace rinsed plates in the sink. Her motions slow and deliberate, Ashley scrolled through her phone at the table, half smiling at something unseen, while Kyle stared blankly at the TV, the blue light flickering against his face. Grace lingered at the counter longer than she needed to, the question forming quietly in her chest. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. I have my quarterly checkup tomorrow. Would you mind giving me a ride? Ashley's head tilted just enough to acknowledge her. Then came a quick laugh, sharp and careless. You're still breathing. You can wait. It wasn't cruel on the surface, but the sting of it settled deep. Grace felt her throat tighten, a familiar heat creeping up the back of her neck, the kind of hurt that came from being brushed aside one too many times. Kyle looked up briefly, sighing. Ash, don't be rude. He didn't say more. He never did. Grace's chest sank under the weight of that silence, the one where no one came to her side, where every word of defense trailed off before it mattered. She nodded, folding the dish towel neatly. It's okay, I'll figure it out. And that was that. No one pushed, no one apologized. The sound of the TV swallowed the room again. Later that night, when the house went still, Grace found herself sitting at her desk, the lamp throwing a small pool of light across the surface. She opened the drawer and looked at the car keys, resting inside. The metal caught the light like something half forgotten. Her hand hovered over them. She hadn't driven in months, not since that afternoon when she tried to go grocery shopping and ended up pulling off the road, her heart racing so fast she couldn't breathe. The panic had come out of nowhere, swallowing her whole. Since then, the car had sat untouched, like a reminder of everything she'd lost control of. She closed the drawer. The sound was final, almost a relief. She couldn't drive tomorrow, not yet. Still, she hated the thought of asking again, hated what it said about her. The clock on the wall ticked softly. Midnight crept closer. Grace stood, pressing her hands to her face, willing the ache behind her eyes to fade. A knock came at the door, gentle. When she opened it, Lucia stood there in her jacket, car keys dangling loosely from her fingers. Her expression was easy, calm. Hey, she said. I'm heading out early tomorrow. Want me to drop you at your appointment? Grace blinked, surprised. Of course Lucia knew. She always seemed to know things Grace didn't say aloud. That's kind of you, Grace murmured. But, no, I'm fine. Really. Lucia tilted her head. You sure? It's no trouble. I'll be right by the clinic anyway. Grace hesitated. She could feel the yes trembling at the edge of her tongue, but habit pulled her back. She forced a smile. Thanks, but I'll walk. Lucia studied her for a moment, not arguing, not pitying, just seeing her. Then she nodded slowly. All right. Offers open if you change your mind. She turned and walked down the hall, her footsteps fading into quiet. Grace stood there for a long time after the door closed, the silence around her suddenly heavy. She pressed her hand to the drawer again, feeling the faint outline of the keys beneath the wood. The thought of walking to the clinic didn't bother her. It was the principle, doing it alone. She'd been doing everything alone for years now, but tonight, the loneliness felt different. It wasn't pride holding her back anymore. It was fear, sharp, quiet, and cold. She moved to the window and looked out at the street below. The night stretched wide and empty, the lamplight glinting off parked cars. Somewhere out there, life was still moving. People driving, living, deciding things for themselves. She envied that freedom. Tomorrow, she promised herself. Tomorrow she'd at least try. She'd get up early, get dressed, step outside, maybe even drive halfway. But promises came easy at night. She turned off the light and sat on the edge of her bed, the darkness pressing close. The echo of Ashley's laughter lingered in her ears, bright, careless, small. It replayed like a memory she couldn't mute. Grace pulled the blanket around her shoulders and stared into the dark until her eyes adjusted. Tomorrow would come, whether she was ready or not. And somewhere deep down, under the quiet hurt and the exhaustion, something in her began to shift. A flicker of resolve, fragile but real. Because maybe she couldn't change how they saw her yet, but she could decide what she did next. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start. The yellowing desk lamp buzzed faintly above Grace's head as she stared at the DMV manual. The pages smelled of ink and dust, and the text swam in columns that refused to stay still. She ran her finger beneath the words, trying to anchor herself, but her mind kept drifting. Driving hadn't just been about errands or independence. It had been control, and losing that had unstitched something deeper. Behind her, the hallway creaked. "You're still at it." Lucia leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, eyes kind. Grace offered a tired smile. Trying, Lucia stepped into the room and sat down on the edge of the bed. "You know, freedom's heavier than keys." Grace blinked at the phrase. Lucia shrugged. "Keys just unlock things. Freedom? That asks something back." The room was quiet for a long beat. Then Grace looked back down at the manual. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's try tomorrow." They started in the empty lot behind the community center. Cracked asphalt, faded lines, not a soul in sight. Grace gripped the steering wheel, jaw tight. Lucia stood beside the open door, calm and grounded as ever. "Just ease forward," she said. "No rush." Grace shifted into drive. Her foot hovered over the gas. The car lurched, then crept forward like a toddler taking first steps. She didn't breathe until it stopped again. Lucia didn't cheer or clap, just gave a small nod. "Good, let's go again." Over the next week, they returned every evening, turning, braking. Parking between cones Lucia borrowed from the parks department. Grace's hands stopped shaking after the third day. Her shoulders didn't tense at every corner by the fifth. She wasn't perfect, but she was moving. The DMV was as awful as she remembered. Hard plastic chairs, flickering fluorescents. A printer that whined like it was in pain. Lucia waited near the exit as Grace stepped up to the counter. "Written or road?" the clerk asked, barely glancing up. "Written." A man named Frankie handed her the test sheet with a faint smile. He wore a frayed vest and bifocals and had the kind of no-nonsense kindness Grace hadn't expected. "Take your time," he said, and meant it. She sat at the booth, her pen trembling for the first 3 questions. Then her breath slowed. The questions were harder than she thought, the phrasing intentionally tricky, but she fought the urge to bolt. 20 minutes later, Frankie checked her sheet. His brows lifted. "You passed," he said, almost surprised. "Barely, but hey, nobody asks your score once you've got the license." Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You want to schedule the road test now?" he asked. "Yeah," she said, her voice steadier than expected. He handed her a date, 3 weeks out. Outside, Lucia stood with both coffees in hand. Grace held up the paper like a fragile trophy. "Road test, 3 weeks." Lucia handed her one of the cups. "Then we practice, every day." Grace nodded. But even as she took a sip, doubt crept in around the edges. 3 weeks. What if she failed? What if she passed? She glanced down at the appointment slip, then out at the parking lot beyond. The sun was beginning to set, throwing long shadows across the pavement. And somewhere inside her, something shifted again. She had 3 weeks to become someone new. The office smelled like lemon polish and old paper. Not unpleasant, just still, like a room that didn't get visited often enough. Grace stood at the threshold for a second too long before Paula glanced up from her desk and smiled. "Come in," Paula said, her voice soft but precise, the way you'd expect from someone who knew exactly what words cost. Grace stepped inside, clutching the folder Lucia had encouraged her to dig out of the closet that morning. She hadn't looked at it in years, not since the ink was fresh and the grief still raw. They sat across from each other at a long lacquered table. A little lamp in the corner hummed, casting a pool of amber light that didn't quite touch the corners of the room. I figured it was time to take a look, Grace said quietly, setting the folder down. Paula nodded and opened it without comment, slipping on her reading glasses. Her eyes moved steadily over the contents, flipping through each page with practiced care. Grace sat back, listening to the dry rustle of paper. It felt louder than it should have. Well, Paula said after a moment, this hasn't been touched in over 12 years. Still lists Kyle and Ashley as the primary beneficiaries. Is that still accurate? Grace didn't answer right away. Her eyes had drifted to the page in front of Paula. There it was. Ashley's name, first line, neat, clean, undeserved. My husband always said. Grace's voice faltered for a moment. He used to say, take care of the people who show up. That was his line. Every time we argued about money, family, anything. That's what he came back to. Paula looked up from the document, her expression unreadable. Do they still show up? The words landed like a tap on bone. Not cruel, just exact. Grace didn't look away, but she didn't answer either. Her silence filled the space like steam rising off hot pavement. Instead, she let her gaze settle on Ashley's name again. Bold, assumed, etched into the center of a plan Grace wasn't sure she still believed in. She leaned back slowly, the leather of the chair sighing beneath her. Things feel different now, she murmured. I don't know what I want to change yet, but I know this version isn't right. Paula gave a single nod. Then we adjust when you're ready. Later, as they walked to the parking lot, Lucia waited near the car, arms crossed, scarf tugged high against the wind. Grace hadn't asked her to come, she just had. Like always. How'd it go? Lucia asked, unlocking the passenger side. Grace slid in, clutching the folder tight against her chest. It's strange, she said, seeing names on paper. It makes things real in a way they weren't before. Lucia glanced over. Yeah, paper has a way of telling on us. They sat for a moment in silence before Grace exhaled and added, Kyle hasn't called in over 2 weeks. Ashley hasn't said more than 3 words to me since the appointment thing. Lucia nodded slowly. Blood is a reason. It's not a pass. That line landed harder than Grace expected. She let it sit for a while, rolling around in her chest like a loose stone. Then, finally, I told Paula things might change soon. Lucia turned the key in the ignition. The car rumbled to life. And will they? Grace didn't answer, but she didn't need to. Her grip on the folder had loosened. That night, back in her room, Grace pulled the will from the folder and laid it out on her desk. The page with Ashley and Kyle's names at the top stared back at her. She reached for a pen, hovered, but instead of crossing anything out, she picked up a blank sheet and wrote 3 names at the top. One of them was her own. She stared at it. Something inside her trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of a shift long overdue. Outside her window, the wind picked up. Leaves scraped along the curb like a whisper trying to be heard. Grace leaned back in her chair, the pen still in her hand. And for the first time, she wondered what it might feel like to leave behind more than money, to leave behind meaning. The alarm went off before the sun even broke the horizon. Grace sat upright, heart ticking fast. Not from fear, at least not the old kind, but something else. Determination, maybe? A soft thrum of it. She moved quietly through the house, careful not to wake anyone. The cardigan hung in the back of her closet like a secret. Pale blue, worn thin at the cuffs, it had once belonged to someone confident, someone she used to be. She hadn't worn it in years, but this morning it felt right, like a circle closing. In the mirror, she didn't look different, but something in her eyes had sharpened. Outside, frost shimmered faintly on the lawn. Lucia waited in the car, sipping coffee and tapping the steering wheel with a kind of nervous energy she didn't bother hiding. You sure you're good? She asked as Grace buckled in. Grace nodded. I'm good. Lucia studied her for a moment, then pulled out of the driveway. The DMV lot looked like it always did. Cracked pavement, faded arrows, chain-link fencing that bent at odd angles. But today, it felt like a stage, like everything was watching to see what she'd do. Frankie stood near the clipboard, bundled in a windbreaker, his breath fogging in the morning air. He smiled when he saw her. Well, look who came back, he said. Same car. Same everything, Grace replied. Except the woman in the seat. He chuckled, scratching something onto his form. Let's see what she's got. They started slow. Grace's fingers trembled on the wheel, but she eased the car forward with care. She remembered Lucia's advice. Breathe between steps. Not before, not after. Between. The first turn was tight. Too tight. She clipped the line but corrected fast. Don't tense, Frankie said calmly, not looking up from his clipboard. You're driving, not auditioning. At the next light, Grace forgot the signal. A small lapse. Frankie made a quick mark. Then she stalled at a stop sign. Foot slipped. Too much brake, not enough gas. Her heart dropped. Just start it again, he said, his tone steady. Happens all the time. She did. And this time, the car moved smooth. They pulled up beside the painted parallel parking zone. 2 cones, 1 dented trash can pretending to be a bumper. Grace's hands were damp. She adjusted the mirror, checked the rear view, and did it. Clean? 1 move? Perfect. Frankie nodded, not smiling, not frowning. Just check the box. They finished the loop. She pulled into the lot, parking straight between the lines. She turned off the engine, hands falling into her lap. She didn't look at him as he scribbled. Didn't ask. Just waited. Frankie tore the top sheet from his clipboard and handed it over without a word. A pale green slip. Pass. You drive like you've got somewhere to be, he said finally, smiling now. That's a good thing, Grace blinked. Then laughed. A real laugh, sharp and warm and involuntary. It startled even her. The sound didn't echo. It landed. Thank you, she said, the paper trembling in her fingers. Frankie tipped an invisible hat. Go be where you need to be. Out in the lot, Lucia leaned against the hood of the car, coffee now cold in her hand. Grace held up the slip. Didn't doubt it, Lucia said, reaching out for a high five. Grace gave her one, then tucked the slip carefully into her bag. It wasn't perfect, she admitted. Nothing worth doing ever is. They got in. Grace took the driver's seat this time, adjusted the mirrors, checked the belt. Lucia just watched her, silent. When Grace shifted into drive, something in her steadied. A kind of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Not loud, not dramatic. Just solid. But as they pulled out of the lot, Grace's phone buzzed in her bag. She ignored it. Then it buzzed again. Lucia glanced at her. You gonna check? Grace pulled to the curb, put the car in park, and fished it out. 2 missed calls. Ashley, and a third, Kyle. She stared at the screen. No voicemails, no texts, just the names. Lucia didn't say anything. Grace locked the phone and set it face down in the cup holder. Then she looked out the windshield at the open road ahead, her foot resting lightly on the gas. Let's go, she said. And this time, she meant it. The rain came down soft that morning, thin, steady, cleansing. Grace stood by the kitchen window, coffee cooling in her hands, the DMV slip still pinned beneath a magnet on the fridge. Every time she passed it, she felt a flicker of something private and bright. Not triumph, more like quiet ownership of her life again. By mid-morning, she was sitting across from Paula once more, the same amber lamp humming on the desk. The air smelled faintly of printer toner and the citrus polish Paula favored. But this time, Grace didn't bring the old folder. She brought a new one, blank, ready. Paula looked up, eyebrows lifting slightly. So, she said, settling in. Ready to make those changes? Grace nodded. Yes. Let's start from the top. Paula opened a fresh template, her fingers moving easily over the keyboard. The clicking filled the silence like a metronome, steady, patient, unhurried. Grace took a slow breath. Keep Kyle, she said. He's still my son. And Ashley, Paula asked without looking up. Grace hesitated. The rain outside hit harder now, tapping against the window pane in uneven bursts. Remove her, she said finally. She made her own distance. I'm just putting it on paper. Paula didn't react, only typed the words with quiet precision. Understood. They worked line by line. The process was deliberate, almost ceremonial. Grace felt each word settle inside her like a decision finally allowed to exist. When they reached the section on the trust, Paula leaned back slightly. You mentioned wanting to add a condition. Grace nodded. I don't want it to be about obligation. I want it tied to behavior, presence. Her eyes met Paula's. Kindness, if that can be written. Paula smiled faintly. It can. We'll draft a clause. Something about consistent compassion or personal involvement. It's unorthodox, but not impossible. Good, Grace said. That's what he needs to remember. The next name came easier. Lucia, Grace said. I want her listed as my healthcare proxy. Paula paused, surprised, but only for a second. You trust her that much? Grace's voice softened. She's the only one who shows up. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the rain and the low hum of the lamp. Paula resumed typing, her tone gentle but matter-of-fact. Then Lucia it is. By the time the will took shape, the pages had grown thick. It was no longer a legal document. It was a story in its own right, a record of what Grace chose to leave behind, and why. When Paula reached the section for personal property, Grace opened the small box she'd carried in with her. Velvet, weathered, the hinges slightly loose. My jewelry, she said. There's some value there, but I want it donated to the women's shelter downtown, the one that helps with re-entry and housing. They can auction it or divide it, doesn't matter. Paula's pen paused just long enough to meet Grace's eyes. That's generous. Grace smiled faintly. It's overdue. They moved on. Grace's house, the one she'd walked through for decades, where laughter had faded into quiet and quiet into resilience. I want the property transferred to a local literacy foundation, she said. They can use it however they need. Make it a reading space, a home for tutors, anything. Just keep my name on it. The Grace Mitchell House for Learning. Paula nodded slowly, almost reverently. Beautiful, she said. Grace didn't respond. Her mind had already moved ahead, to Kyle's section. She traced the margin of the draft with her fingertip. Leave a small sum for Kyle, she said finally. Modest, but enough to mean something. Paula made a note. Any stipulations? Yes. Grace's gaze sharpened. He only receives it if he visits. Alone. Not with Ashley, not for money, just to see me. Paula set her pen down. Grace, you know that might never happen. Grace nodded. Then he doesn't get it. The words didn't hurt as she expected them to. They felt clean, finished. When everything was signed, Paula stood to walk her to the door. You've made clear choices, she said softly. That takes courage, Grace smiled. It's not courage, it's clarity. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet pavement and new beginnings. Lucia's car waited by the curb, engine idling, music playing faintly through the half-open window. Grace climbed in, setting the new folder carefully on her lap. Lucia gave her a questioning glance. All done? All done, Grace said. Lucia nodded, pulling away from the curb. Feels different now, doesn't it? Grace looked out the window. It does. Like I drew a line I didn't know I could, Lucia grinned. Then here's to lines that stay drawn. As the car rolled forward, Grace's phone buzzed again in her purse, 3 times in quick succession. She didn't reach for it, not right away, but something in the sound, urgent, repeating, made her pulse skip. She finally pulled it out. This time, it wasn't a call. It was a text. From Kyle. Just 6 words. Mom, we need to talk. Now. Grace's thumb hovered over the screen. Outside, a horn blared somewhere down the block. The light ahead turned red. Lucia glanced over. Everything okay? Grace didn't answer. She just stared at the message until the screen dimmed, her reflection faint in the glass, and for the first time in a long while, she couldn't tell whether what came next would break her, or finally set her free. Ashley was 30 minutes late, which felt appropriate. She blamed traffic, though it wasn't traffic's fault. The truth was, she'd sat in her car outside the law office for 10 full minutes before walking in, scrolling through her phone, waiting for the right emotional temperature, something between casually concerned and morally superior. Paula's office looked the same as it had 12 years ago. Warm light, wood trim, shelves lined with legal books that no one ever actually read. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and patience. Ms. Mitchell, the receptionist asked, "You can go right in." Ashley adjusted her coat, smoothed her hair, and pushed open the door. Paula looked up from her desk with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ashley," she said. "Thanks for coming." Ashley set her bag down and crossed her arms. I was told my mother made some changes to her will. That's right, Paula gestured toward the chair across from her. Have a seat. Ashley hesitated, then sat. The leather creaked under her. She expected a folder, a form, maybe a list of disbursements. What she didn't expect was Paula's calm, deliberate tone. Too measured, too final. Your mother came in a few days ago, Paula said. She was very clear about what she wanted. She asked me to make sure her decisions were communicated properly. Ashley frowned. Communicated properly. What does that mean? Paula folded her hands. It means she left instructions for what to share and how. Ashley blinked, impatience rising. Okay, so what exactly am I here for? To sign something? To contest something? Paula's eyes softened, but her voice didn't waver. No, you're here because she wanted you to receive this. From the drawer, Paula pulled out a single white envelope, unmarked except for Ashley's name, written in her mother's looping, deliberate handwriting. She said to tell you she handled it, Paula added quietly. Ashley's brows knitted. Handled what? Paula didn't answer. She just slid the envelope across the desk. Her movements precise, professional. The paper was heavier than Ashley expected. She turned it over twice before breaking the seal. Inside was one sheet. No letterhead, no signature, no closing. Just a single line, written in black ink. You laughed. I learned to drive. Ashley read it once. Then again. The words didn't make sense at first. They were too small, too bare. Then the memory surfaced, the sound of her own laughter echoing across the kitchen table, the cruel weightlessness of it. Grace at the sink, back turned, shoulders tight. A night that had ended like every other, silence, avoidance, the TV humming in place of conversation. Ashley felt her throat tighten. What is this supposed to mean? Paula looked at her evenly. It means exactly what it says. Ashley's voice broke on the word. She changed everything, didn't she? Paula didn't confirm or deny. Your mother was thoughtful about her choices. She made them without anger. Ashley set the letter down on the desk as if it burned. She wouldn't do that to me. Paula's expression didn't shift. She already did. Ashley stood abruptly, her pulse thudding. The room felt too small, too airless. Can I see the documents? I'm afraid not, Paula said. They're sealed until the executor authorizes distribution. Ashley's laugh came out sharp, defensive. So that's it? One sentence, and I'm supposed to, understand her, forgive her. Paula closed her folder gently. Sometimes understanding isn't the point. Sometimes it's the consequence. Ashley froze, the words slicing through her composure. Outside the window, rain began again. Light at first, then steadier. The same sound that had filled the office when her mother was last here. Ashley stared down at the paper, the ink beginning to blur where her fingers had pressed too hard. You laughed. I learned to drive. The phrase looped in her mind until it stopped being words and became something else. A verdict, maybe, or a mirror. Did she? Ashley swallowed hard. Did she say anything else? Paula shook her head slowly. Just that you'd understand it one day, when you stop thinking it's about you. The rain tapped harder against the glass. Ashley gathered her bag with trembling hands, leaving the letter where it lay. But as she reached the door, she hesitated, just for a breath. Then she turned back, grabbed the paper, folded it into her coat pocket, and left without another word. Paula watched her go, expression unreadable, then reached across the desk to straighten the envelope Ashley had torn open. She set it neatly atop Grace's file and whispered under her breath, almost fondly. She handled it, all right. Outside, Ashley stepped into the rain. The ink on the letter bled through the fabric of her coat pocket. A small spreading stain she didn't notice. At the curb, her phone buzzed, Kyle's name flashing on the screen. She didn't answer. For the first time in her life, Ashley Mitchell had nothing left to say. The phone rang in the kitchen long after sunset, its tone cutting through the steady hum of the refrigerator. Grace let it ring twice before answering. Kyle, she said quietly, not surprised. Her son's voice came through fast, uneven, carrying the sound of someone caught between anger and confusion. Mom, what's going on? Ashley's been calling me nonstop. She said you changed your will. She said you cut her out. Grace pressed the receiver closer to her ear. The air around her felt still, weighted. I did make changes. Why? His voice cracked on the word, the boy still inside the man fighting to understand. What happened between you two? Grace moved to the window. The sky was bruised with dusk, streetlights flickering on one by one. Nothing new, she said. She laughed. I listened. That was years ago, he said, incredulous. She was joking. Grace let the silence stretch. Then, gently, so was I when I thought that was love. Kyle exhaled sharply, the sound more wounded than angry. Mom, come on. You can't just erase her. She's my sister. She still is, Grace said. That doesn't mean she's mine to care for anymore. Kyle went quiet. Grace could hear the faint scrape of his thumb against his phone, the nervous habit he'd had since childhood. Finally, he spoke again. She's hurt. She thinks you're trying to punish her. Grace closed her eyes. If she feels punished, then maybe she's finally listening to something other than herself. Mom. Kyle, Grace interrupted, soft but firm. You're still in my heart, but she's not in my future. The words came out calm, measured, and final. They didn't tremble. On the other end, she could hear him swallow. That's harsh, he said. Harsh, Grace repeated, the word foreign on her tongue. No, sweetheart. Harsh is silence. Harsh is being invisible in your own house. I lived that long enough. Kyle didn't reply. She pictured him then, standing in his apartment, one hand in his hair, pacing the way he always did when things didn't fit neatly in his world. After a moment, Grace's tone softened. Come have tea with me, she said. Just you, no one else. He hesitated. Tea? Yes, she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. You still take too much sugar, I remember. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was searching. Grace could feel him weighing something on the other end of the line. Guilt, maybe, or love, maybe both. I'll think about it, he said finally. Grace nodded, though he couldn't see it. That's all I ask. When the line went quiet, she stayed where she was, staring out at the street. The wind had picked up again, stirring leaves across the pavement. She hung up slowly, her hand lingering on the receiver before setting it back in its cradle. For a moment, she stood in the kitchen's pale light, listening to the house breathe, the faint creak of wood, the tick of the clock. Then she turned toward the hallway, where Lucia leaned against the doorway, arms folded. You heard? Grace asked. Lucia nodded. Most of it. Grace exhaled, the weight in her chest easing. He's thinking about coming. Lucia tilted her head. And if he doesn't? Grace looked down at her hands. The skin was lined, the veins faint but visible, a life written in quiet endurance. Then I'll have tea anyway, she said. Lucia smiled faintly. You sound ready. Grace met her gaze. I am. Outside, a car engine turned over in the distance. Then another. Headlights flashed briefly across the window before disappearing down the street. Grace didn't notice. She was still standing by the phone when it buzzed once more. A text this time, soft against the counter. She glanced at the screen. Kyle. I'll come by Sunday. Alone. Grace set the phone down, her breath catching in her throat. Not from fear, not from relief, but something in between. Sunday, a day she hadn't realized she'd been waiting for her entire life. She turned off the kitchen light, the hum of the refrigerator fading into dark. And somewhere in that silence, for the first time, Grace allowed herself to believe that closure might sound less like an ending, and more like footsteps coming up the drive. By Monday morning, the neighborhood had found a new pulse, and its beat was Grace Mitchell. It started small, a comment under a photo, a repost of an old picture from a 4th of July barbecue. Grace in a red apron, smiling, her arm around Ashley. Then came the caption, some people forget who was there when it mattered. Sad to see my own mother turned against me. It didn't take long for sympathy to pile up like dry leaves. You deserve better, Ash. She's been off for years. Maybe she's unwell. By noon, 2 old friends from Grace's book club texted, Hey, are you okay? Call if you need to talk. Grace read the messages at her kitchen table, coffee cooling beside her. The phone buzzed again. Another message. This one from her neighbor, Ruth. Ashley says you've been manipulated by that woman who drives you around. Grace stared at the text until the words lost shape. She set the phone down, folded her hands, and took a slow breath. The house was still, filled with the faint smell of toast and rain-damp air. She didn't reply. Instead, she reached for her notebook, the one she'd started the night after rewriting her will, and opened it to a fresh page. Her handwriting was neat but deliberate, like she was carving the words instead of writing them. Let them talk. I used to disappear quietly. Now I'm visible, and they call it madness. Visibility, it seems, is always inconvenient to those who depended on your silence. She closed the notebook gently, her pulse steady. When Lucia arrived an hour later, carrying groceries and the smell of fresh wind, she found Grace at the table, her coffee still untouched. "You've seen it, huh?" Lucia asked, sliding the bag onto the counter. Grace nodded once. "Apparently, I'm being controlled." Lucia gave a wry smile. "If you're being controlled, you're doing a lousy job of it." Grace almost laughed. "Almost." "I haven't replied to anyone," she said. "Not one message." "Good." Lucia pulled out a carton of eggs, her voice even. "Let them talk. You're the one with the keys." Grace looked at her. "Keys?" Lucia shrugged. "Freedom ones, the kind that don't fit anyone else's locks." That earned a small, real smile. On Wednesday, Grace signed up for volunteer orientation at the Literacy Center, the same one that would one day bear her name. The coordinator, a brisk woman with tired eyes, seemed relieved to have her. "We've got a wait list for students," she said. "Most of them just want to be heard." That line stayed with Grace. By the following week, she was tutoring twice on Tuesdays and Thursdays, helping adults learn English through short stories and simple conversation. It was there she met Marisol, a 20-year-old woman who worked nights cleaning offices downtown. Shy, soft-spoken, with a laugh that sounded uncertain, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to enjoy herself. The first time they read aloud together, Grace noticed how Marisol hesitated on certain words: freedom, believe, alone, as though each one carried too much weight. "You can take your time," Grace said softly. "There's no rush here." Marisol smiled, small and grateful. "Thank you. No one ever says that." Grace blinked, her throat tightening. They should. Each week they grew more comfortable. Grace brought tea. Marisol brought questions. One afternoon, as sunlight spilled across the table, Marisol asked, "Why do you help? You don't have to." Grace thought for a long moment before answering. "Because someone once forgot to help me," she said, "and I don't want to be that person again." Marisol nodded, as if she understood something bigger than the words. By the time Grace drove home that evening, the posts online had begun to quiet. Rumors were running out of oxygen. Ashley had moved on to new dramatics, a new job, a vacation photo, another indirect caption. But the damage lingered in whispers and sideways glances at the grocery store. Grace didn't flinch anymore. She parked, turned off the engine, and sat in the quiet hum of cooling metal. Out of habit, she opened her notebook and added a single line. Silence used to mean surrender. Now it means peace. She closed it and glanced at the empty passenger seat. Lucia had left her scarf there the day before, faded red, smelling faintly of cedar. Grace folded it neatly and smiled to herself, but when she stepped inside, the phone was already ringing. She checked the screen. Private number. Her hand hovered for a beat. Then she picked up. "Hello?" A pause. A breath. Then a familiar voice, unsteady, defensive, threaded with guilt. "Mom, it's Ashley." Grace froze, her pulse a slow, deliberate thud. Ashley's next words came in a rush. "I think I made a mistake." Grace said nothing, not yet. She looked toward the window, where the last light of the day was slipping behind the rooftops, soft, amber, fading. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "You did," she said. "But that doesn't mean it's too late to learn." Ashley exhaled, something between a sob and a sigh. And for the first time in years, neither woman hung up. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the fragile beginning of something neither of them had words for yet. The call came just after breakfast. Grace was washing the last mug when the phone buzzed against the counter, the vibration cutting through the morning stillness. She dried her hands and answered. "Grace, it's Paula." The lawyer's voice carried its usual calm, but there was a note of something else underneath, formality. Grace smiled faintly. "Good morning, Paula. I was just thinking about calling you." "Well, I beat you to it," Paula said, then paused. I wanted to give you a heads up before the paperwork lands. Ashley's filed an informal challenge against the will. Grace didn't move. The mug stayed in her hand, warm from the water. On what grounds? She's claiming diminished capacity, Paula said gently. Nothing official yet, just noise. But it'll generate paperwork, and we'll need documentation to close the door on it. Grace let out a quiet breath. She really went there. I'm afraid so. But this won't go far. We just need to demonstrate that you're clear, independent, and competent. Which, frankly, you always are. Grace placed the mug on the rack, her reflection flickering in the kitchen window. So what do we do? I'll schedule a cognitive evaluation, Paula said. 1 session. You talk, answer a few questions, maybe complete a short test. It'll all go on record. Grace's voice was steady. Fine, let's do it. The clinic was modern, all glass walls and soft colors meant to calm nerves. Grace sat in the waiting area, reading the day's crossword on her phone. She'd filled in most of it before they even called her back. Dr. Chen introduced herself with an easy handshake and an even easier smile. I'm told you're only here to make lawyers happy, she said. That's the story, Grace replied. Inside the exam room, sunlight fell across the white table, the kind of light that makes everything look honest. Dr. Chen gestured for Grace to sit. We'll just talk a little. I'm less interested in what you remember and more in how you think. Then you're in luck, Grace said. Thinking's still my bad habit. They started simple. Dates, names, a few pattern puzzles. Grace answered without hesitation. When asked to recall a short story read aloud, she recited it nearly word for word. Then came the personality inventory, questions designed to catch inconsistencies. Grace caught herself smiling through some of them. Do you ever lose track of time? Only when people waste it. Do you ever forget why you walked into a room? Of course, she said, usually because someone else left it messy. Halfway through, Dr. Chen set her clipboard down, studying her. You're remarkably lucid, Grace. Most people get defensive in these situations. You're composed. Grace tilted her head. If I start defending myself, it means I believe the accusation. That earned a small laugh from the doctor. Point taken. They moved on to logic puzzles and word associations. Grace breezed through, correcting one of the prompts halfway in. You've got a misprint here, she said, pointing out a grammatical error. Dr. Chen raised an eyebrow. Do you do crosswords often? Grace grinned. Every morning. I still beat people half my age at tournaments. Then I'd say your cognition's fine, the doctor said. And your humor's intact. When the assessment ended, Dr. Chen shook her hand again. You're more articulate than most of my interns, she said warmly. I'll have the report ready in 48 hours, but I can tell you now, everything's excellent. Grace smiled, her relief quiet but real. Thank you, doctor. Nothing to thank me for, Chen said. You're the kind of patient who reminds me why I still like this job. 2 days later, Paula called again. I have it, she said, her tone brighter. The official letter came through. You're fully competent, articulate, focused, and in Dr. Chen's words, emotionally clear. That's a rare compliment from her, by the way. Grace chuckled softly. Maybe I'll have it framed. I already did one better, Paula replied. I've sealed the certified copy in your estate file. Ashley's claim won't stand. Legally, it's over. Grace exhaled, slow and measured. Thank you. She'll calm down eventually, Paula said, though she didn't sound sure. But if she doesn't, well, she's out of moves. Grace hung up, the quiet of the house wrapping around her again. She stood by the kitchen window, the late afternoon light soft against the glass, and for a long time, she didn't move. Then she reached for her notebook. They doubted me once because I was quiet. They doubt me now because I speak. It seems doubt was never about me at all. She set the pen down, looked out at the driveway where Lucia's car usually sat, and smiled. Her phone buzzed again, this time not with a call, but with a message. A photo. Kyle, standing in front of her house, alone. Here, early. Hope that's okay. Grace's hand stilled on the page. The clock ticked. Somewhere in the distance, a door closed. She stood up slowly, her reflection caught in the glass, steadier than it had ever been. And as she moved toward the front door, she felt no fear, no hesitation. only the faint, thrilling tremor of something beginning. Sunday had come early, and this time, she was ready to answer it. Kyle stood at the front step, bouquet in hand, shifting his weight from one foot to the other like he used to when he was 12, and caught lying about homework. The flowers were an awkward mix of grocery store lilies and daisies, too bright, too mismatched, but sincere in their clumsy way. Grace opened the door before he could knock twice. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Time seemed to slow around the edges, the quiet between them stretching like glass, fragile, reflective. "Hi, Mom," he said finally, voice low. She took in his face, lines she didn't remember, a beard trying to hide his exhaustion, the dark circles beneath his eyes. He looked like someone who'd been trying to fix too many things at once. "Hi, sweetheart," he held the bouquet up, sheepish. "These are, well, they looked better in the store." Grace smiled, soft but real. "They're perfect." She stepped aside. "Come in." They didn't go straight to the table. Instead, Kyle lingered by the window while Grace filled the kettle, the sound of running water filling the silence that always followed him home. He seemed smaller in her kitchen somehow, the old familiarity muted by guilt. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, unsteady. "I should have said something sooner." Grace turned, leaning lightly against the counter. "About what?" "About Ashley, about everything." His shoulders dropped as though the confession cost him something. "I just keep the peace. Always have." Grace studied him for a long moment before responding. "Keeping peace isn't the same as keeping silent, Kyle." He nodded, eyes downcast. "Yeah," he said softly. "I see that now." The kettle began to rumble. Grace poured the water over 2 tea bags and carried the cups to the table. He joined her, his fingers fidgeting with the paper sleeve of a sugar packet, though he didn't open it. "Do you hate her?" he asked suddenly. Grace looked at him, the steam from her tea curling between them. "No," she said. "I don't have that kind of energy anymore." Kyle exhaled, half relieved, half confused. "Then why?" "Because love isn't the same thing as permission," she interrupted gently. "And for too long, I gave both to people who didn't earn either." Kyle's eyes flickered with something like recognition. He looked away, his jaw tightening. "She's been saying you've changed?" "I have," Grace said simply. "And that's what scares her. It means I don't play the same part anymore." They sat in quiet for a moment. The tea cooled. Outside, a dog barked twice before settling down again. Later, when the dishes were rinsed and the kettle had cooled, Grace slipped on her sweater and said, "Walk with me." They took the old neighborhood loop, the one they used to walk after dinner when he was younger, racing leaves down the gutter, his hand clutching hers. Fearless and curious, the sidewalks hadn't changed, but everything else had. Kyle shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. "I used to think you and Ashley would always find your way back. I didn't know how far it went." Grace smiled faintly. "Neither did I, until I did." They turned a corner where the trees arched overhead like a cathedral. The air smelled faintly of rain and warm asphalt. Grace's steps were slow but steady, the kind of rhythm she'd fought hard to reclaim. "I still love you," she said softly, eyes on the horizon, "but she doesn't live here anymore." Kyle stopped walking. For a moment, he looked like he might argue, but then his shoulders slumped. His voice cracked when he spoke. "I didn't know how much she hurt you." Grace met his eyes. "I know. That's why I still love you." He nodded, the motion small but full of ache. "I thought staying neutral was helping." "It wasn't," she said, her tone gentle but sure. "It was just another way of leaving." He blinked, the words hitting something deep and unguarded. Then quietly, "I don't want to leave anymore." Grace reached out, touched his arm, and smiled. "Then don't." They stood there under the slow fade of evening, 2 people who had lost each other without meaning to, and were now somehow finding their way back. By the time they returned to the house, the porch light had come on automatically. Grace unlocked the door and turned back to him. "Tea again on Sunday?" Kyle's eyes glistened, but he smiled. "I'll bring better flowers." Grace laughed softly, the sound warm and full. "That's not the part that matters." He stepped off the porch, pausing halfway down the walk. "Mom?" "Yes?" "I think I get it now. The driving, the will, all of it." She tilted her head. Do you? He nodded. You were trying to prove something wasn't gone. Grace's voice was a whisper. And was I? He smiled faintly. No, it was just waiting for you to start the car. When his car disappeared around the corner, Grace stood in the doorway for a long time, the night air brushing cool against her skin. Inside, the house felt different, lighter, less like a holding cell, and more like a place that had exhaled. She looked at the table where the wilted bouquet rested, one petal already fallen beside her teacup. Then her phone lit up on the counter. One new message, from Ashley. He came to see you. What did you tell him? Grace read it once. Then she turned the phone face down, unplugged the kettle, and whispered into the quiet. Nothing I didn't mean. Outside, a wind picked up, sweeping the fallen petal away. And somewhere in that small, soundless moment, Grace Mitchell realized she no longer needed permission. Not even from the past. The letter came on a Thursday, plain envelope, no return address. Grace's name written in Ashley's careful, familiar loops. The ink had bled slightly, as if the words themselves were uncertain. Grace found it in the mailbox between junk mail and a grocery flyer. For a while, she just stood in the driveway, the envelope resting against her palm, the late-day air still and warm. She carried it inside, set it beside her tea, and waited until the water boiled before opening it. There was no greeting, no signature, only one line, centered on the page in steady handwriting. There's a difference between aging and being disposable. You taught me that. That was all. The hawk circled once more overhead, dipping low before vanishing beyond the ridge. The horizon burned amber and violet, the light catching the windshield of her car like a wink. Grace stood, brushing the dust from her hands, and turned toward the road. She felt the hum of possibility waiting at the edge of motion, the same pulse that had carried her through the tests, the courtroom, the silence, the rebuilding. For a long moment, she looked back at the view, the one that had never judged, never laughed, never asked her to be smaller. Then she smiled, the words leaving her mouth steady and sure. I still drive. The wind caught the phrase and carried it outward, scattering it across the valley like a promise. Grace walked to her car, opened the door, and paused just long enough to breathe in the evening air, alive, unhurried. Entirely her own. Then she started the engine, and this time it purred like recognition. The notice came folded inside an envelope stamped with the bold logo of a local auto auction company. Grace didn't open it right away. She already knew what it was, Ashley's doing. Lucia found her sitting on the porch later that morning, the envelope unopened beside her coffee mug. The sun was just high enough to catch the silver streaks in Grace's hair. She's selling it, isn't she? Lucia asked. Grace nodded, smiling without bitterness. The old sedan. I figured she would. She never did like driving something that wasn't new. Lucia frowned. You sure you're okay with that? Grace reached for the letter, finally tearing it open. The words were brief. Vehicle sold, proceeds to beneficiary. The rest was legal jargon. She folded it neatly again, tucking it back into its envelope. Let her sell the metal, Grace said softly. I kept the movement. Lucia stared at her for a beat, then laughed. That might be the most Grace thing you've ever said. Grace chuckled too, the sound light. You'd be surprised what you can keep when you stop confusing things for freedom. That afternoon, Grace stood on the lot of a used car dealership outside town. Rows of vehicles glinted under the sun, some polished, some past their prime. She wasn't here for prestige. She was here for something that felt like her. Her eyes landed on a teal hatchback parked off to the side. A little faded, a little dented, but solid. The kind of car that had stories baked into its upholstery. The salesman approached with the easy smile of someone used to talking people into things they don't need. Nice choice, he said. Reliable, low miles. You want to take her for a spin? I already know she'll go, Grace said, climbing in. That's enough. The seat was comfortable, the steering wheel warm from the sun. When she started the engine, it hummed quietly. No drama, no hesitation. Perfect. A few hours later, the papers were signed, and the teal hatchback was hers. Not Kyle's, not Ashley's. Hers. She drove it straight to the bank, deposited a check made out from the sale of her old car, and wrote a second, anonymous, check to the Literacy Foundation. The teller glanced up. Would you like your name on the donation receipt? Grace smiled. No need. The work will speak louder than I ever could. 2 days later, she was in Paula's office again, sipping coffee from the mug Paula always kept waiting for her. I saw the paperwork come through, Paula said, tapping a manila folder. You didn't have to donate that. I wanted to, Grace replied. The car carried me through every version of myself. It's only right it keeps going, Paula nodded, quietly impressed. You're remarkable, you know that? Grace gave a small, amused snort. No, just thorough. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. Make sure that trust is rock solid, Paula. No loopholes. I want the foundation protected, no matter what. Paula smiled. It already is, but I'll double-check everything. You've built something that lasts, Grace. That's not easy. Grace looked out the office window where the city shimmered in midday heat. Nothing worth doing ever is. Saturday came again, and the classroom buzzed with low chatter and the scratch of pencils. The air smelled faintly of coffee and cheap perfume. At the front of the room, Grace helped Dani, her youngest student, sound out the last line of Charlotte's Web. When Dani reached the end, her voice broke, just slightly. I finished it, she whispered. You did, Grace said. Every word. Dani threw her arms around her before Grace could respond. The hug was fierce, unexpected. Real? Thank you, Dani said into her shoulder. I didn't think I could, Grace smiled, smoothing her hair. Neither did I once. Later that afternoon, Lucia found her sitting at the back of the classroom, the teal hatchback visible through the window. You donated the car money, didn't you? Lucia said, leaning against the doorframe. Grace didn't look up from the stack of graded papers. I did, Lucia crossed her arms, shaking her head fondly. You rewrote your ending. Grace glanced at her, a hint of humor in her voice. No, she said. I just stopped letting other people hold the pen. Lucia smiled. Same thing. They walked outside together. The sun had begun to set, painting the sky in the same hues as Grace's new car, soft teal fading to gold. Grace touched the hood, feeling its faint warmth. You know, she said, for the first time in years, I don't feel like I'm still proving something, Lucia grinned. Then what are you doing? Grace looked toward the open road, practicing joy. The horizon shimmered, and the wind lifted her hair as if applauding, and for a fleeting, perfect second, Grace felt what she'd spent years chasing. Not freedom, not revenge, but peace, steady as the road beneath her wheels. The house was quiet that morning, sunlight drifting through the thin lace curtains like soft applause. Grace sat at her writing desk, the one she'd rescued from storage years ago, its surface worn smooth by ink and time. On a single sheet of stationery, she typed her obituary, not as an act of morbidity, but completion. Grace Moreno Mitchell, 72, survived by choice, by learning, and by the miles she drove alone. She paused, reading it aloud. The words sounded right, unembellished, honest, hers. Below the final sentence, she left several blank lines. Not out of indecision, but invitation. The rest, she whispered, is for someone else to fill in. She slipped the page into an envelope and tucked it inside the top drawer, next to the green DMV pass slip she had kept all these years, the one Frankie had handed her with that knowing grin. The metal drawer closed with a small click, like a seal pressed on a chapter well-lived. By afternoon, the sky had softened into a pale blue streaked with high clouds. Grace took the teal hatchback out for a drive. Not to go anywhere, just to move. The wind was cool through the open windows, music low on the radio, some old tune she half remembered from her 20s. Every landmark she passed felt familiar but lighter, like the world had stopped being something she survived and had become something she shaped. She stopped at a red light near the downtown bookstore. A woman stood on the corner, phone in hand, spinning in small circles, her brow furrowed. She looked lost, the same kind of lost Grace had once been. Grace rolled down her window. You all right there? The woman startled, then laughed nervously. GPS died. I'm trying to find the library, Grace pointed with her chin toward the next block. 2 turns down, left at the mural with the red door. You'll see it. Thank you, the woman said, relief washing across her face. I'm late for my volunteer class. Grace smiled. That's a good reason to be late. The light turned green. Grace waved and drove on, her chest full of something warm. Not pride exactly, but connection. That evening, she sat by the window, journal open, pen in hand. The air carried the scent of rain, though none had fallen yet. Lucia's column was spread across the table beside her, folded open to the line Grace loved best. Some women shrink to fit the spaces they're given. Others build new rooms. She began to write. Her pen moved slowly, each stroke deliberate. Freedom doesn't always roar, she wrote. Sometimes, it starts with a laugh you don't return. She smiled at that, knowing it was true. Silence, when chosen, had its own kind of power. Grace flipped to the next page and paused. For a long moment, she simply listened. To the hum of the refrigerator, the soft hiss of wind through the trees, the steady rhythm of her own breath. Then she began again, her handwriting looping with finality, confident and alive. My daughter-in-law laughed when I asked for a ride to the doctor, so I let her walk into the lawyer's office alone and learn what I drove away with. The pen rested at the edge of the sentence. She reread it, and instead of anger, she felt peace. Not vengeance, but symmetry. Grace closed the journal, its spine soft from use, and set it beside the photograph of her husband. In the picture, he was laughing, sun catching his hair just so. She touched the edge of the frame with 2 fingers. "You like the teal one," she said. "It drives honest." Outside, dusk gathered, the kind that painted the horizon lavender and gold. Grace stepped onto the porch, breathing deep. The air was cool, clean, the kind of evening made for motion. She took her keys from her pocket, turning them once in her hand before walking toward the car. The door clicked open, the engine responding like an old friend. In the rearview mirror, her eyes looked steady, curious, unafraid. Grace backed out of the driveway, slow and deliberate. The headlights stretched ahead, lighting a path she no longer questioned. For a moment, the road rose to meet her, and the hum of the tires sounded like a heartbeat. She smiled, whispering to no one and everyone all at once. "Still driving." The night accepted the words, folding them into its quiet, endless miles,